Welcome to the Private Parts of Wellness, where we take the pressure off of perfection and talk about real stuff like hormones, sex, aging, healing, and all the messy, beautiful, and yes, of course, private parts of life. A quick heads up, I swear, I talk about adult things, and this podcast may not be carpool friendly unless your kids are asking you about libido and trauma. So listeners, please use discretion and headphones. Also, I am not your provider. I am not a therapist. However, I am a certified family nurse practitioner and certified menopause provider with the Menopause Society. But again, I am not your provider. So if you hear anything that makes sense to you, anything that you think, this is what I want to do, please talk to your people and don't do anything before you talk to them. All right, so my name is Jessica, and as you know, I am a certified family nurse practitioner and certified menopause provider. I'm a former doula, yoga teacher, and I've spent close to 2 decades researching what gets us hot. And I mean that in every way. Libido, love, passion, purpose, power. And I love sharing what I've learned. Today's episode is for anyone who's loved a man or been one. And we're going to be talking about Gen X men, childhood trauma, hormones, libido, kink, EMDR, healing, and why some men seem to fall apart at midlife. But maybe it's not a midlife crisis. Maybe it's just the pain that never got expressed. If you listened to the last episode, I talked all about ACE score and menopause. Specifically, Gen X women and the DREAM study. And I had promised that I was going to talk about men, so let's do that. I started reading a book called I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terrence Real. And this, I don't want to talk about it, is about men and depression. But this concept of covert depression hit me like a truck. Real doesn't talk about the ACEs score, which, if you listen to the last episode, is adverse childhood experiences. But as someone who is surrounded by trauma, making that connection with the ACE score and men and their emotional lives. So if you didn't listen to that episode, I encourage you to listen to it, and you can go through those 10 questions. So the ACE score is there are 10 questions about your early life. Stuff like emotional neglect, addiction in the household, abuse, and of course, divorce. And the research shows that, and we talk about early in life because it's these experiences that happen to you before the age of 18. And the research shows that people with an ACE score of 4 or more, well, they are likely to have a higher risk for everything from depression to chronic illness to sexual dysfunction. And in fact, 4 or higher in some interpretations can be something that they consider to be living with toxic stress. And as I mentioned in the last episode, it's this sense of toxic stress is where you can't even find peace when it's looking you straight in the face. Terrence Real describes covert depression as a kind of depression that doesn't look like depression at all. It may look like anger, withdrawal, addiction, overworking, and yes, sometimes just straight up dickish behavior. Now, we're also, of course, making grace for mood and changes in mood and kind of the ebb and flow of emotions. But we're talking about like somebody you're like, this guy is just a fucking dick. He's just an asshole. When I think about the men that I've known, family members, lovers, friends, so many of them were likely living with this kind of depression, a masked self-sabotage or emotional distance. And they weren't taught it was okay to feel sadness or fear. They were given instead, they were given alcohol or sports or just silence. In the book, Terrence Real talks about the movie The Great Santini. Now, a quick story. The Great Santini with Robert Duvall, who I had this bizarre crush on, like, do not ask why. And it was probably like the Apostle version of it. Anyway, I'm odd. But anyway, in The Great Santini, that movie was the first movie I ever saw on like a family date where my dad had decided that we were all going to do something. I was going to introduce me to his partner, his girlfriend at the time, who was very young. And we went to see The Great Santini, which is so fucking inappropriate. And it was at that theater. If you're from Chicago, it's the one that's like right on, like by North Avenue. Shit, I don't remember what it's called, but it was like that tiny theater, and I saw lots of movies there. But The Great Santini, which was about a father's abuse. It is such a brutal fucking movie. He talks about that movie. It's a side note. Anyway, as a Gen Xer myself, we were the latchkey generation. The generation that was given a key to come home, let ourselves in, have a snack, do our homework, get it done, take the chicken out of the freezer, whatever we needed to do, our chores, kind of until our parents got home. And that's also the generation of, do you know where your children are? Like that would go on if you do not know at 10 p.m. every night on TV. And the translation of that is like, we were alone a lot. We were alone physically, emotionally, and boys grew up without models of healthy masculinity. I can even say possibly zero emotional language and no permission to feel. And now we see that shit may not be getting much better. Even when we think about like that movie, Adolescence, I'm not getting into that. I can't even bear to watch it. So let's just focus again on Gen X men. So in the last episode, I talked about ACE score, hormones, and menopause. And some people may mock the idea or debate it that men go through this andropause or a male menopause. But the reality is that all human beings have the same hormones: estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, prolactin. They just have different amounts, and they all will shift with age. For some men, testosterone levels can start to decline at around the age of 30. I used to work in men's health specifically, and the idea was that, or the language that we were given to explain this was that at the age of 30, your testosterone drops about 1% every year. So what you had at 30, possibly, right before that, at that time of maybe, let's just say a peak, right? It starts to drop. So you've dropped by 30% by the time you're 60. High cortisol, there's a link to cholesterol and testosterone. Maybe we'll do that another time, but high cortisol from chronic stress, and we can think about that ACE score, that toxic stress, living with that toxic, can also further suppress testosterone. And we see that manifested in fatigue, mood issues, low libido, erectile dysfunction, just all of it. Rogers and Coleman found that early trauma blunts testosterone response to stress. So if you're thinking, I'm just getting old, maybe, but it's also possibly, or I might even put money on, but I don't have money to put on it, but you know what I'm saying, unprocessed trauma that could be jacking up your hormones. And it's not just the hormones. Trauma changes your body and your nervous system. So it's not all in your head, just like I had said in an episode about menopause when I started the episode about ACEs and menopause. It's about your body, your stress response, your relationship, and your sex life. Another interesting fact that I just heard, and I have not done a deep dive on this, but when we think about epigenetic trauma, meaning the trauma that's passed down generation to generation, we know that trauma, 3 generations in, the DNA has changed. And apparently, while the egg, when we're thinking about sex, egg and sperm meeting, the egg chooses the sperm also holds that changed DNA. So what our grandfathers, great grandfathers might have gone through may also be affecting where you're at today. Super side note on top of that. I mentioned that I used to teach yoga. I also practiced a particular type of yoga for a really long time. And we would do kriyas, and kriyas were like prescriptions for, and it could be bullshit, doesn't matter. But there was one for cold depression, and cold depression was the depression that you held in your body that did not belong to you. Maybe we'll talk about that in another episode. The point is that some of this stress, some of the events that happened prior to your 18th year on this earth are affecting you now in your 50th plus years, in your 5th decade. So let's talk a little bit about kink. I've been thinking a lot about kink. Kink is something that comes up, something that people ask me about. And when I was teaching yoga, I used to teach privately. And I noticed that I was a pretty stern teacher because I was doing a lot of lineage. I was part of a lineage that was very stern. And there were a lot of men who loved it. They loved it if I came to their house and I was fully dressed. In fact, one time I was actually pregnant. So I wasn't in like a sexy yogic body. I mean, although pregnancy is pretty hot, but the more stern I was, the more they would want to rebook me. And I thought at one time about becoming a yoga dominatrix. And a movie director was listening, because Mother Has Lived, done a lot of jobs, was listening to me talking about that. And he was like, I would totally hire you. And looking back on that time and now, and the more I learn, when we think about men in kink, specifically submissiveness, it makes sense because it allows certain people to finally let go, to stop performing, to feel safe, and to just be. For men raised on control and emotional shutdown, a consensual, structured space of submission might be the first time that they felt disarmed. And while that's not therapy, and it may not be your yum, and it may be something that's not accessible to you, I just want to say that there are different ways to go about healing. And I wrote a blog post actually about some of the research around kink and healing. In the book Sovereign Love by Danae Logan, which I think I've mentioned time and time again, she talks about healthy masculinity being grounded, emotionally available, and in integrity. So while kink may be on one far extreme, um, there is still a way to feel grounded, emotionally available, and in your integrity. But we need to have examples. And I say we because, as you know, I've never been a boy. Or if you didn't know, I've never been a boy. I will not be a man. But me as a cis female is also implicated in this. Uh, so the question again is, how can that be the default, meaning that being healthy masculinity, if men have never seen it? And you can't become something you've never seen necessarily. And I don't know how many Gen X men have seen it. So, in Danae Logan's book, she talks about healthy masculine traits versus unhealthy masculine traits. Just so we're all on the same page, let me just read to you what these healthy masculine traits are versus unhealthy. Healthy masculine energy is create safety, witnesses without judgment, hold space, present without a goal, integrity and awareness, guides, committed to truth, listens deeply, supportive and encouraging, faces fear, knows death, humble, seeks mentorship, reflective, peaceful and grounded, observes beyond what is seen, responds instead of reacting. And this is versus aggressive, stuck in mind, not present, cold and distant, competitive, withdrawn, bullying, struggles to communicate needs, has to be right, reactive, withdrawn, runs from love, narcissistic, needs to fix, avoidant attachment, afraid of failure, ignores emotions. Now, everyone can experience these things, and there are times where everyone needs to step into their healthy masculine, regardless of gender identification, and people fall into their unhealthy masculine as well, or wounded masculine energy. So it's healthy and wounded. Those are the opposites. And I just want to share those with you. And I think that it takes, even for me, to think about where am I wounded masculine, because single parenting is a thing. Whether you were raised by a single parent, whether you were a single parent, it's a whole thing. Anyway, I wanted to share that with you. So we've talked about kink. We've talked about ACE. You can find the 10 questions on the past episode, and we've talked about this covert depression. Now I want to mention an opposite to, it's more in the sexual realm, because we've talked about how our ACE score can affect our libido, can affect our chemical makeup, right, with testosterone. But here's another controversial thing, orgasmic meditation. So there was a person, Nicole Krauss, I think that's how you say her name, who does something called oming, orgasmic meditation. Now, this is a super controversial practice. I've never practiced it. I know people who have practiced it or do practice it. And I got to tell you, there are certain things about it that are pretty magical. You can look it up. But the whole organization was a bit of a problem. And uh, yeah. However, she did a study around ACE score and trauma, and that her OM meditation, which is a 15-minute meditation, uh, she felt that that was very healing for people, and they were able to have a higher level of arousal and more positive emotional response, uh, regardless of their ACE score when they practiced oming. I guess that's because it is a sexual practice, but there's no penetration, there's no chance of kind of infection. There's no chance of, it's very consensual. It's structured, no performance, no pressure. It's just being present for 15 minutes. You, again, don't have to try oming, but the principle does kind of hold that safe, intentional touch can be healing, and it allows the body to experience intimacy without fear. So a more traditional modality would be something called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a therapy that helps people to process trauma, and very often without reliving it. So you follow these eye movements or tactile sensation while focusing on the sensation or the memory, and then the brain does the work of reprocessing. So I've tried something called brain spotting, which is similar, where you find a visual point and notice how you feel in the body. But EMDR was first developed for trauma survivors and has been widely used in the VA hospital system to treat PTSD in veterans. The science shows that the science shows that it helps the brain to integrate trauma instead of staying stuck in that fight or flight or even fawn loop. So if you're a man, you've taken the test, you've Googled it, you're like, oh, what's this about? Or you listened to your partner might have listened to the other episode and it's like, do this thing, right? If you're a man with a high ACE score, covert depression or trauma that's kind of haunting your libido, because sometimes it's sex that drives us to get help. EMDR can help you to find peace without having to spill your guts out as traditional therapy might. And another caveat about this, a lot of times when we think about ACE score, and we think about emotions, we think so much about women and we don't think about men. That's why I'm bringing this up. So, couple final thoughts. And it's another story I want to share. Remember, I told you that my dad had me see the Great Santini. He took me to see the Great Santini. He was always kind of doing inappropriate things, to be honest. He was a very explosive guy, uh, physically huge, 6'3.5", over like really close to 300 pounds, big booming voice, full beard, and would look over his glasses at me and look down because I'm not that big. And when I was 21, my father began therapy. Now, before he began therapy, when I was about 12, he started the process of losing everything. And by the time I was in my 20s, and he had lost everything. But that was the time for him to start to go to therapy and unpack some of this trauma. And he talked about his traumatic childhood. So his assholism, his drug abuse, all of that was probably covert depression. And in that book, I don't want to talk about it, he talks about that when we have covert depression, we do need to eventually have overt depression. It's got to come out. When he began to express his overt depression, I started to feel some sort of way. And it wasn't that I felt unsafe. I was already living on my own. I was very grown in my head. But I do remember thinking, like, what the fuck is going on? This guy's crying all the time. I didn't have the support or examples to process him like that. He had always been tough, kind of like, get the fuck over it. Go ahead, cry. Cry if you're going to cry. That was one of the things he used to say to me. Closed off, and he had a reputation of being a total asshole. But it wasn't until later, as I truly firmly moved into adulthood and became a parent myself, that I could see his, and I'm getting emotional. I could see his brilliance and how misunderstood he was. Because he did asshole shit, but it all came down to he was a boy who wanted to be loved. And as he named me because he wanted me to have a strong woman's name. And he wanted me to be in my power. And especially as a mother to my daughter. But for my son, he wanted my son to know that a man could be as big as him, as loud as him, as overpowering as he could be. But that my father could also be soft and safe and loving and open. And legacy, that legacy matters. So for women, we need to take a look at ourselves and see how we are presenting or how we're coming across or holding space almost in our healthy masculine for the man that is courageous enough to fall apart, to heal. But at the same time, we cannot save them. This is men's work. We need to see as women how we reinforce emotional restraints when men cry, express fear, and if we flinch because we're not used to it and we weren't shown how to receive it because we are Gen X as well. But at the same time, also step away. Because we can say that this is their work, or as my friend said, it's his water to carry. I encourage you, if this speaks to you, to know your ACE screening tool number. Consider asking for help and seeking help, seeking a community of men. Final real life example. Recently, a coworker at the clinic that I work at who knows that I've been looking at ACE scores and incorporating them into the menopause work that I do, and also the young folks that I work with, just as a touch point, just to give them more information about themselves, to make, or hopefully to take pressure off and make folks feel a little less broken. Anyway, this male colleague, coworker, decided to take the ACE score himself. And he was really curious. And then he was texting his family members, especially his brother, who I guess has gone through struggles. And interestingly, this coworker's score was much higher than he expected. And his brother's was even higher than his. But the beauty is that he and his brother started to have a conversation about their shared past and ways that they could heal. And that is the fucking power of awareness. I'm going to leave it at that. If you like this episode, please comment, share, ding it, bell it, all the things if you're looking on the YouTube. I love YouTube. I'm sorry. I'm like an old YouTube. Whatever, who cares? But like it, share it, review it, 5 stars. People have given this podcast, not the episode, I hope you do give the episode 5 stars. But anyway, thanks. It really helps. It helps people get the word out, and it helps me to improve, to get out this information to you. If you want to dive deeper, I lead something called the Radical Pause Salon Experience, where it's only in the New York and adjacent kind of areas. I come to you and we talk about the questions that you have around sex, aging, trauma, healing in real life, in real time, your people, your gathering, and we get messy together. You can also check out the Menopause Anarchist on my Discord channel. That's it. I have Discord where we talk about menopause, the different stages. You can start your own chat group within it. And I also like talk about tarot. Why not? I don't have a book, but I do have a chapter in a book, and here it is. Oops, I would have got notes attached to it. Here it is for you to see. It's called The People's Book of Human Sexuality, Expanding the Sexology Archives by Routledge Press. The chapter, The Erotic Power of the Professional Nurse and the Body They Move In. It's wild. It's beautiful. Check it out. And up next is going to be a series on the 6 senses, how they ground us in anxiety and how they change as we age. So some practical, some woo-woo, all of that together. Until then, stay messy, stay curious, and take care of your private parts. Thanks. Quick disclaimer. This podcast is not just a quick disclaimer to end with. If you're struggling, reach out to a licensed therapist, provider, or someone you trust. This info shared here is for education and conversation purposes only. This podcast is not medical advice. Okay, till next time.